This video is really applicable to all endurance athletes, whether you're a cyclist, runner, rower, triathlete, whatever your sport may be, short distance endurance or long distance. What I want to talk about today is the 5 key reasons as to why more training or more volume isn't necessarily always the answer to breaking through your performance plateaus. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Thanks to everyone who has been following along and supporting the channel. I know I have been a little bit quiet recently, but we're going to try and continue to get some great content out to you. So if you want to keep up to date, make sure you are subscribed by hitting the big red button down below. Very, very close to 3,000 subscribers. So absolutely unreal if we can tick off and get through to 3,000. And head over to Instagram as well, at NJ_sportscience in the bottom corner here. Go check out all the great content coming up on Instagram. A few different things to what you see here on the channel as well. So make sure you go check that one out. Today's video, we're talking about 5 key reasons as to why more volume isn't necessarily the way to go. So I guess where this stems from is a conversation I had and a bit of a debate really with a client in the lab the other day, early in the week, really going through the reasons as to why doing more volume and actually reducing a bit of their volume would be beneficial. Now, to give you a bit of context, we were talking about an athlete who was racing over about an hour period. So their common events that they were typically training and competing for would only last 1 hour. And they were thinking about going out or had been going out and doing excessive amounts of volume and not necessarily working on the intensity component as a preference, which really, when we break it down, look at it logically, if we're racing for an hour, it is mainly about how hard can you go really at threshold and how long could you sustain threshold for, because fundamentally threshold is that theoretical 45 to an hour period we need to be working for. So or we can work for. So it's a type of thing that doing more volume, I mean, going out and doing a 4-hour ride kind of doesn't make sense in the context of doing an hour event. Maybe we can reduce the volume, focus a bit on intensity and bring in some other components. So that's where I want to break down a couple of key things. So the first thing I wanted to bring up when it comes to athletes who might not benefit from doing more volume, and it's a classic thing, you might read it all the time, if endurance athletes need to do volume, we need to have increased volume, etc. These are some of the points that I think really hold true for a lot of amateur athletes who sometimes get that balance a little bit wrong. So the first one here is high acute load at the end of the day is going to lead to a higher injury risk. I know it seems a little bit obvious, but the more training you do, yes, in the long term, building up a higher chronic training load, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, but building a high chronic training load is great for resilience to injury, being able to bulletproof you against it. The more you've done and the more you've banked previously helps you be a bit more preventative against injury. But higher acute load, so a single week, if you go and increase your training volume immediately in a short period of time, so if, for example, next week I go out and do an extra 3 hours on top of what I've normally done, that is going to lead to a higher risk of injury. It may not cause an injury, but high acute loads can be there. Why is that the case in terms of injury? Well, we're just more susceptible to breaking down when there's more stress on the body. You do more training, there's more opportunities for you to get injured. Think about it that way in terms of a simplified version. So that's really the first one. That's where we see a lot of amateur athletes go wrong. They just train too much and they end up breaking down. We see it a lot in runners, getting injured through things like just calf strains, hamstring strain, Achilles tendinopathy, runner's knee, ITB issues. All of these are overuse injuries, and all of which, in terms of overuse injuries, are preventable. You just need to not train as much and train a little bit more effectively in the time that you are going out there and training. So the first one is higher acute load can lead to more susceptible to things like injuries, particularly overuse injuries, which obviously less time training, if you're on the sidelines injured, is never a great thing. Number 2, more volume is not always specific. Mentioning my example before, if you're racing and preparing for events that are 30 minutes in length. Maybe you're a 5K runner who's looking at 20 minutes or maybe sub 20 minutes. If you're a 5K runner who's going for half an hour even, all of these events are quite short in nature. They're still endurance, and you still need to go out and build some Ks to an extent and build some muscular endurance in the system. By no means am I saying volume is bad and we need to cut it out. What I'm saying here is it's not specific for these types of events. If you're an Ironman athlete, an ultra distance runner, you're doing a 50K, 60K, 100 mile, obviously, Ironman distances, we know 180 Ks on the bike is one component of it. We've then got the marathon run and the swim too. So in circumstances like that, you need to build the Ks. But it's the type of thing, if you're planning in an Ironman to be on the bike for, say, 5.5 hours, is there a need to go out and do an 8-hour ride? Obviously not. Most people aren't going to do that. That's a bit of an excessive example. But it's the same principle that holds true for something like an hour event. If you're a sprint distance triathlete who's racing for exactly an hour, your bike leg might only be half an hour. So is there a need to go out and do 3-hour bike rides on the weekend? Probably not. We might focus our time on how can we get that half an hour window as quick as possible, but allow us to recover so then we can get onto the run and be as fast as possible off the bike as well. So it's what is actually specific for the types of events and races that you're actually training for. Do we need volume, or do we need to focus a bit more on the intensity? That should be a key starting point when determining should I increase one or the other, or should I be playing around with what I'm doing in my training before I look at things like getting tested and all that. If I'm just going simple on where should I increase or decrease parts of my training, have a look at, well, what's specific to my event? What do I actually fundamentally need to do? If volume is a part of that, great. Start to increase the volume. If your event is short, an hour in nature, there's no reason to go really above and beyond and do crazy amounts more, 3, 4, 5, 7 times the amount of volume that your event actually demands. You need to do some, but you don't need to do excessive amounts. Focus more on what is more appropriate and what is actually going to make or break your race. In short stuff, it's going to be intensity. In terms of number 3, your muscular endurance and your aerobic engine or your aerobic endurance might actually already be good enough. We see this time and time again in the lab. We see, and you might remember back to our series talking about the lab data and some different variables, things like that. We commonly look at a metric called fraction of expired oxygen. So it's measuring the percentage of oxygen in the air that you're breathing back out. What does that give us? That gives us an understanding of how well you're actually using oxygen at the working muscle. So what we can map out in long, slow intensities through a VO2 max test, for example, is we can have a look at those lower intensities. We can see quite a consistent trend in terms of that FVO2, which what that tells me is the muscle's actually handling it pretty well. Intensity is going up. I'm using a good amount of oxygen. I'm actually maintaining that good percentage usage of oxygen, if you like, as the intensity is going up. I'm pretty comfortable. And all of a sudden, the high end starts to decline. And why is that the case? Muscle gets saturated at the top end intensities. We just can't process oxygen fast enough. Our aerobic power is lacking, but our aerobic endurance is good. You can feel like you go all day, but you don't have the speed in the legs. And that's a common thing that we hear from a lot of athletes is they go, well, I feel like I can do lots of work. I just want to go faster. And that's the key part. For me, they're missing that top end speed work. So their muscular endurance actually is already good enough. They might already be able to go out and run 10 Ks comfortably off the bike. But more volume isn't necessarily helping them to go faster. They can already run that. They can do that all day. You can get them to go tomorrow, do a bike session, jump off the bike, and they could run 10 Ks if you wanted to. But can they do it quickly? That's a different component to their performance and their training that's going to get them there. Number 4, more volume obviously is less time for a couple of key things. Gym and strength, recovery, more time to go and do a mobility session, more time to maybe do a Pilates session or yoga, whatever you're into outside of just your running, your cycling, your swimming, whatever your sport might be. It's obviously going to mean less time to do those extra things, which for some athletes who are time poor, and I guess this really fits in with athletes who are not professionals. We're not all on pro hours. We can train and do whatever we want. For those who are a little bit stuck for time in and around work, in and around family commitments, whatever it might be, trying to get training in is hard enough, but trying to get up some of those extras that are really going to probably make your training a little bit more effective. So whether that is 1 or 2 strength sessions a week in the gym, doing some basic foundational stuff to give you that increased movement capacity, increased general strength as well to help bulletproof a little bit against injury, we know is great, but then also improve that just the pathways between your brain and your muscles. Increase your coordination is going to help with things like the biomechanical aspects, running economy. There's heaps and heaps and heaps of studies of how strength training can directly impact and positively impact your running economy to make you a faster and better athlete overall. So less time in those aspects. And then the obvious one is less time in recovery. If you've got more training hours, that means there's less time for you to grab that quick snack in between when you're training and when you have to go to work or go to a meeting or do something else. Nutrition is impacted then. What is that going to impact? That's going to impact their recovery. More training, we might have to wake up earlier in the morning. What is that going to impact? Potentially how much sleep we're getting each night. Now we're really starting to damage that adaptation process. It's all very well to go out and fatigue ourselves and feel like we've worked hard, but if we're not adapting to the training and having a positive adaptation because our recovery is inhibited, that's where we start to see no real impact on our performance. We actually just start to fatigue for the sake of fatigue, which isn't going to lead to any gain overall. And the last point here, number 5, is it's limited in its function to help you go faster. What I mean by this is at some point we need to practice going fast to go fast. And particularly if your event is one of these shorter endurance events, 45 hour and a half, maybe less than 2 hours, if you're a half marathon, for example, going out and just practicing long and slow. And I always use the example of 5-minute K pace because it's one that I think a lot of athletes can relate to. If you're a runner or a triathlete or you do some sort of running, you go out and you always train at 5-minute Ks, and you just did volume, didn't necessarily work on the high intensity. That's a very simplistic look. Obviously, there might be some high intensity there, but if your main focus was 5-minute K pace, that isn't going to help you get better at running at 4:15 pace if you're only practicing a slower speed. Going and practicing 4:15 is where it's going to help you get up there. And wherever that sits on your spectrum, 4:15 might sound really, really fast. 4:15 might not be that quick for you. Doesn't really matter. The point of this example is to show you that running long and slow, first and foremost, is going to get you really good at that. But if that's not specific for your event and you need to practice running faster because your race intensity is actually higher, you're not going to be able to, you're not really doing that. We're sort of wasting a bit of time at the lower speed. Coming back to, I guess, that point before in terms of what is specific for your event. Do we need to do more volume at that longer, slower? Is that actually your specific race intensity? If yes, great. If not, well, we may need to focus a little bit more of our time, more of that race specific intensity, and sort of challenge ourselves more from an intensity perspective rather than just a volume perspective. The other side of things as well is there's a couple of studies to say that in terms of just going out and doing long and slow, the average in terms of where we can get our VO2 max to, if you were just to focus on a high volume and a high long, slow volume, long, slow, continuous volume training methodology and sort of scrap the high intensity, can only really max out at about 60 mils per kilo per minute in terms of oxygen consumption, our VO2 max, which 60 for you might sound high. If you're a VO2 max in the 40s or 50s, 60 might sound great. In terms of elite values, elite athletes are getting up, we know, are getting up to 85, 90 VO2 max, 95 even. Sometimes we might say it very rare. That's the type of thing that we can't get there unless we follow the second part of the equation, which is the high intensity side of things. Why target one area of our physiology that is going to lead to our mitochondrial change, all those positive aerobic adaptations, when we know there's a second training methodology, the high intensity work, that is actually going to target those same adaptations, but from a different pathway. Let's work on multiple methods to the same end to maximize our time in our training, get best bang for buck rather than just going all in on one. Can sometimes do that for short periods, and yes, it can have a bit of effectiveness. I'm not saying it's not necessarily effective, but what I'm saying here is that you're going to be limited at some point. If all you do is volume, at some point, somewhere in your physiology or somewhere in your training goals, you're going to want to try and go faster. You want to try and continue to improve. And unless you do a little bit more on the intensity side of the spectrum, if you move away, that's where you're going to see the gain. If you don't, if you just stay at the volume, you are inevitably going to be limited. We've seen it time and time again where athletes in the lab reach a plateau in their performance because they're just missing that extra piece and they're focusing too much on the volume. Sometimes it is a case of just cutting the volume and maintaining a bit of the intensity that can actually lead to the performance gains through any of these points I mentioned before. So there's a couple of breakdowns, bit of a quick conversation today. Just want to keep it nice and simple. A couple of quick thoughts around, is more volume necessarily better? Not always. Sometimes it is, and there are stages where it is, and by no means is a video bashing volume, and I'm not anti-volume in terms of training methodology. Has a time and its place, but I just wanted to talk through, I guess, a few examples, particularly for our short and intermediate length endurance athletes, that hour, 90 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. Some of these points probably ring true for you guys, so hopefully you got a little bit out of this video. As always, continue to keep subscribing and sharing these videos across the channel. Really do appreciate the support, and head over to Instagram as well, at @NJ_sportscience. Check out all the great content happening over there. Leave down in the comments below today. I want to find out, what is your feeling about volume? Has more volume helped you, or have you found sometimes more volume or reducing your volume has actually been a benefit to your performance? I want to hear that down below. Let me know your thoughts as always. Always keen to engage in the comment section. Otherwise, that is it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.